Welcome to the Hope After Narcissistic Abuse podcast. I am your host, Amy Helms. Each week, you will hear from experts across the country and even world speak to you on recovering from narcissistic abuse and even how to manage these relationships. You will also hear some periodic solo episodes on how to manage these relationships and what recovery is like. It is my hope that you will leave each episode with some renewed hope that you can and will beat this. Thank you for tuning in. Hey, welcome to another episode of Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. Today's episode, we have Miles Mason. Miles is an attorney and a CPA, although he practices as a divorce attorney in Memphis, Tennessee. He brings a wealth of experience and knowledge, especially with dealing with narcissism and how to divorce a narcissist. And the show notes, you will see several links to his blogs and videos that you can refer to. Today, we'll be talking more specifically about just how to divorce a narcissist and financial abuse. Thank you, Miles, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let's start off with, what is financial abuse?
Financial abuse is crossing the line between smart budgeting and control. So many people believe that in order to eventually retire, you've got to have a pretty strict budget and stick to it. Fine, that makes perfect sense. But what tends to happen if one of the parties is very controlling is that they try to clamp down on spending. Well, spending is an adult activity. And what you'll see is that there's this progression over time, ratcheting up the level of control, including but not limited to, saying, limiting access to marital funds, limiting access to credit cards and ways to use those funds. Right? So there'll be a strict budget, and what you'll eventually see, especially now that technology is so much important part of our lives, the abusive spouse will have fraud alerts and get notifications upon anything being spent by the other spouse. Now, what that means is, while controlling spending is in general a good idea, what it turns into is the abused spouse not being able to spend any money on themselves, or not having access to financial resources to, say, consult with a lawyer or do anything that's not pre-approved by the other spouse. Well, at some point, we cross over that line and it becomes a situation that's almost as bad as physical abuse, because it's going to change a person's personality over time. The design is to erode the self-esteem, self-confidence, and ability of that person to make smart decisions in their own best interest.
So then it becomes isolating because you don't have the resources to really do anything.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Including therapy.
Right. When I was married, we had a spreadsheet that turned into a profit and loss statement. It turned into pie charts, and each one spreadsheet fed into the next, And, I was supposed to itemize hairspray, baby wipes, and then the groceries were dry goods versus grocery or pantry, and then refrigerated, frozen foods. And then there were categories. And from that, it had categories. And then at the profit and loss statement, it turned into the grocery store versus eating out, and then children versus adults. And it was asinine, but if I didn't do it, there was trouble, and I had to explain for it.
Yeah, in general, and I guess one way, as a CPA, I see the spreadsheets as a wonderful thing. Okay, for us financial We love spreadsheets. Okay. The question is there a budget item for other? Okay. So I don't have a problem with budgeting. I don't have a problem with spreadsheets, but it is the first step towards the crossing that line into negative control, because you need to budget for what you don't know, okay, for life. You know, if you're saving for a trip to Disney World, that needs to be in the spreadsheet. Okay. And if you and I guess one of the telltale signs would be if the supported spouse feels uncomfortable asking for something for themselves, you know, and I'm not talking about a $1,500 pair of shoes. I'm talking about just basic $200 a month to go see a therapist. And if you don't feel comfortable asking for that, that's a big red flag for me.
Yeah, I guess those need to be two-way conversations, you know, and how we're going to budget and, you know, what those categories are. Can it be, you know, items for, you know, children's healthcare, or can it be, you know, items we use to get ready in the morning, or does it have to be, you know, minute little categories that it would take a long time to prepare a budget? So how is this used in a divorce process against each other? You know, we're talking about relationships versus divorce.
Right. So by the time, let's say I have a spouse in my office that's been the victim of financial abuse, they won't know most of the time they've been a victim, just like emotional abuse. All right. So I'll figure that out probably an hour into the initial consultation, maybe 20 minutes, who knows? But what's very interesting about it, there's a couple of different problems. One, identifying the behavior is step one. Step two is figuring out what do we do with it, okay? Now, my experience has been often positive, because if the divorce has fallen through, there's money in the estate because the spouse was very frugal. And one of my most memorable cases, I represented the wife of the neurologist. And the neurologist was fanatical about saving money, which is good because my client had been married a long time. They didn't live in a big, expensive house. He didn't drive a big, expensive car. And there was a significant amount of money to divide, which allowed my client to not really have to work that much after the divorce, which is nice. But the other side is, what was the damage to the emotional core processor, if you will, of the abused spouse? Okay. So this particular spouse didn't have no restrictions. She could still do art. She could still do a lot of things, but it was certainly frowned upon and made her upset about it. Now, once we identify that we have the financial abuse situation, one of the positives is I've got the financial records to the penny. We need to get a copy of those spreadsheets, a copy of the program, because a lot of couples have personal financial software that they use because it's super easy to pay bills now, all that other kind of stuff. But so in some ways it makes my job easier. Where it makes it tremendously difficult is for my client to begin the recovery process. And the only way we can get the person into starting the recovery process is convince them that they need recovery, that they need therapy and counseling. And that's one of the things I ask every therapist and counselor I ever talk with. Do you have advice for the lawyers on how to convince somebody who's been the victim of abuse that they need to go talk about it and understand how it impacts their personality and decision making? And the reason that's terribly important is we're going to have a divorce settlement coming within the next 3, 6, 9 months, maybe even a year, that we need our client to exercise clear judgment and not be colored by the emotional damage that's occurred over a long period of time that seeped into their personality and their confidence of their decision making. Do you have any advice for us lawyers on how to convince somebody that they need to take that time and have those conversations with a counselor or therapist?
That's so important. I'm glad you asked that. In the last episode, Courtney Fields and I talked about that because in this stage, people are in a trauma response. And when questioned in a courtroom, it's often, when people will dissociate and not even know what question are being asked or what question they're answering. It's a fight, flight, freeze response. So it's almost like they're envisioning the spouse asking questions. And so it'll be shutdown mode. And so even just explaining to the client that, right now, you're not thinking clearly because you've been through a trauma. And in order to, answer the questions more effectively, it's important to be able to answer the questions as you would have, before the marriage, as you would have before going through this trauma. The body holds trauma, and you will answer questions through that trauma lens, almost like the red sunglasses. And so let's prepare you for that.
But as you know, sometimes logic doesn't enter into the equation as much as we might like. So that's always a challenge, especially for those of us that aren't terribly empathetic, because one of my core philosophies is I've got to worry about the problem, not the person first. And sometimes it comes across as uncaring, but I care tremendously about making sure that I do my job professionally and get them the money that they need to get. And when you're dealing with somebody that's that controlling, that is a very difficult challenge.
And that's when logic goes out the window. There's no logic when dealing with an abusive person or a narcissist. It doesn't make sense because there is no logic.
Well, in a weird way, it becomes a net positive for this reason. A lot of narcissists in divorce work from the same playbook.
They do. It's like a bobblehead, they play their game, and so they're predictable.
To some extent they are. It depends. I was preparing mentally for this interview. One of the things that I could tell you is not every, and again, to be clear, we're not using a clinical definition here. We're discussing what common everyday vernacular considers narcissistic behavior. So many narcissists aren't that strategic in their thinking. They have a few core concepts that they're working off. For example, I want to look good to everybody in my office and in society, but a lot of times they slip in front of their spouse and their kids. They get angry, they get impatient, that sort of thing. A true narcissist wouldn't even lose their frame, if you will, in front of their spouse or their children. They're going to maintain it for everyone. Well, that takes a tremendous amount of discipline and a tremendous amount of strategic positioning and thought. And if somebody's that good, their spouse won't even know it. And then you've got the other identifying trait of, sure, they've been controlling, manipulative, gaslighting, all the usual narcissistic supply tools, but a lot of those same tools, traits, tactics have helped that person be tremendously successful. Because one of the things that entrepreneurs and other businessmen are taught is how to eliminate that which does not matter from your mind. And if you're incredibly disciplined, what other people think about you isn't terribly important. But to a narcissist, it is. So there's a little bit of a conflict there when you're dealing with. And so I caution myself from trying to say, oh, well, he's a narcissist. We're going to do A, B, and C. What makes it interesting is we're not going to have a pre-programmed game plan. We're going to wait and see what the narcissist does and react, which drives some of our clients crazy. Well, what are we going to do? We're going to be patient. We're going to see what tactics are used and respond to them, and I'll coach you through it. And they say, well, can you give me an example? Okay, I'll give you an example. If he or she decides to not give us documents we need, well, you and I are going to sit down, we're going to craft a strategy, and we're most likely going to end up going to the judge with this very specific punch list of documents we need. And the way you sell that to a judge is very simple. I got to draft a settlement. I need to know what I'm settling. And most judges say, well, Mason, you can have your documents. And they look at the other lawyer and say, how long is it going to take you to produce them? Well, we'll get a court order. Well, does a narcissist follow the court order? Maybe not. Okay. If not, then we got to go get another one, and then another one, and then another one. And so what happens is the narcissist is testing not their spouse, but their opposing counsel at that point. Can you be patient? Can you do what is necessary to get the job done? And that level of success is very interesting because it's possible to work depending on the lawyer and how busy they are and what kind of resources they have behind them, namely administrative and paralegal support. So that's an example of how it plays out. But I can tell you from almost 30 years of dealing with narcissistic spouses that rarely, while the tactics appear similar and are relatively finite and predictable, which ones are used in which order are almost always unique.
I think back to your question about, getting someone into therapy, back to just the general term narcissism, they do tend to go after successful, smart women because it does help with the ego, that dynamic. And, people that are, have that, successful, I'm good. It does tend to have that stereotype of going to therapy. I should know better. I shouldn't need this. And so it can be a little bit hard to admit I need help.
Right. And what I see is that they've self-identified the abuse in the relationship, or so, a friend or family member has said, this is your problem. Here, read this book. They read 10 pages in the book. They say, yeah, that's me. And they think they're on the road to recovery once they've identified it. What's so insidious about it is how it just seeps into your soul, if you will, into your core personality, and essentially changes your DNA. Okay? And coming out of that, as therapists, there are lots of ups and downs and extremes that come following that realization. What is scary to me as a divorce lawyer is I need that clear head, because we're going to make some decisions that are going to impact the rest of your life. It could be $100,000. It could be millions of dollars on the line. And how do I advise somebody who's either terribly angry, terribly sad, and the emotional response they're having is rational and reasonable?
Mm-hmm. I had a therapist say kind of those words to me, why don't you just go kind of practice what you're going to be saying in court? And that kind of led to ongoing work. And it was a way in the door for that therapeutic work. But it was, it was used as, why don't you go just practice? And I can tell them some things you might be asked. And what if you use that as just, practice for, being asked questions?
Absolutely. That's a great idea.
And then it was really the tricky way to be, he called the therapist, she needs help. So,
yeah, because one of the things, especially for court, what you don't want to do is appear angry and bitter. That'll turn off any judge. Even the lawyer, I can explain in openings. Look, my client's angry. He or she's been abused for the last 15, 18 years. She was scared to death of talking to anybody about these problems. It interfered with a relationship with her kids, this, that, and the other. He or she said he or she couldn't go back into the workforce. And so all these terrible things that have happened to my client has impacted negatively. Now, the only way I'm going to get real evidence into the record about the damage is through a mental health professional or a vocational expert. But it's still going to come off as anger and bitterness instead of, I just want to get my fair share of the net marital estate. And that can be tremendously challenging for the lawyers.
So, do you offer any advice to people listening that might be in this journey, or is it just something to work on with their attorneys?
Right. So the core advice is pretty straightforward and nothing terribly unique. Number one, get an emotional support team. Most clients, when they come in to visit with me, already have identified a friend or family member who's helping them with the journey. And most likely that person's been telling them for the last several years, you need to go see a divorce lawyer, okay? So I like to include the emotional support team in decision-making whenever we can. Now, granted, the emotional support team members are not under the attorney-client privilege, but what are the discussions we're having? Do you need to go get counseling or therapy? And we maintain, like many lawyers, we maintain a list of people that locally that they may want to go visit with. Also, if we have access to a list of mental health professionals that's available on an insurance program through their employment or their spouse's employment, we're going to call one of our trusted psychologists in the area and say, who on this list should we refer our client to? So we'll do some of that work for them. The financial support team is there to help pay the bill and make advice regarding potential settlement and help make some financial recommendations on what's fair, just, and reasonable. And sometimes that might include a certified divorce financial analyst, which is always very helpful. And then we're the legal team, okay? And so that when we break it down that way, we try to say, look, you don't want to rely on my therapy skills because I've never been trained. I'm not a big hugger. I'm not the guy you hug. I'm not the guy you invite over to your house for beverages, a glass of wine. No, nobody invites me over for that. I'm a tool, okay? And hopefully a good sense. I'm here to maximize the likelihood of a fair, just, and reasonable settlement. And then if we can't settle, represent you, be your voice in the courtroom. And a lot of times we get a lot of confusing looks from our client. And then we know, the other side of the same coin is a very popular saying, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so by our actions, not by our words, we try to show we care a tremendous amount about the details of making sure that we're doing what needs to be done to not just adequately represent, but zealously represent them. And sometimes that means, getting back to the narcissist, waiting until the narcissist makes their move on the chessboard or not for making that decision, whether to turn left or to turn right. We make recommendations, the client makes decisions, okay? And one of the keys to divorcing a narcissist is making sure you fight the right battles, okay? Because not every battle needs to be won in this war in order to succeed. Yeah. And narcissists love to create, one of their items straight out of chapter 1 of their playbook is create a number of battles, which creates, just steals emotional energy from the other spouse. And so we've got to be prepared, both in terms of endurance and willingness to endure through the process, and be strategic in which battles we choose to fight and which battles we choose not to fight.
So what are some battles that you've seen recently that you've told people this isn't really important?
That's a great question, because there's different levels to that analysis. And I'll answer the question, I promise. Let me get there. So there are problems that don't impact the divorce settlement, but impact how we get there. There are other decisions that are tremendously personal. And one of those are the pets. Now, so let's say I'm representing the husband, and the wife is the abuser. And she knows that this dog, we'll call him Spot, is essentially the pet of the husband. And she's going to create an additional battleground by saying, I want Spot. I want Spot to live with me. I know you moved out of the house. You didn't take Spot with you then because the apartment didn't let you. Spot's now mine. So we have to analyze this from a number of different perspectives. Number one, is this just a strategy by the woman just to annoy, right? Second, does my client care about Spot, or can he just go get another Spot? All right, which clients have done. They'll go get the exact same breed of dog, exact same temperament, or they say, "Oh, I've always wanted a Frenchie. This is a good opportunity." Because one of the great ways to fight a divorce is be careful what you ask for. You might just get it. Okay. So our first offer, we're going to be talking about, even though Spot from a financial standpoint means nothing, the judge is not going to want to hear an argument about Spot. And that's a whole different discussion, but we're talking about it in terms of narcissistic behavior.
They made a movie about that.
Yeah. So, but I'm talking about how do we really analyze it. Yeah. So I'm going to give the client pros and cons and whether we need to go to war over Spot. And one of the things we've got to decide is, do we wait till trial to bring up Spot, or do we bring up Spot and ask for a court hearing for the return of Spot? And if one party has been taking the dog to the vet, feeding the dog, cleaning the poop the whole time, I mean, that's a pretty simple answer for the judge to rule on. But again, do we really want to create that conflict early? And we have to discuss, what if the judge says, well, you left it behind, you left Spot behind, too bad, go get another Spot, which would embolden the abuser much more than $100,000. Okay, because it's not about the money. It's about the control and the punishment of the abused person for not doing what they were told. Okay. And then, because it's more than just entitlement, it's the joy of the slap. All right. How to abuse somebody after you're physically separated becomes the job of their attorney. So as we go through that analysis, one answer for many of my clients have been, get a Frenchie. Frenchies are awesome. You can have them in an apartment. You can crate them up. They got a lot of energy. You got to go walk them when you get home from work, but they'll always be happy. They got a great, so even if you had a lab before in a big yard, no, don't get another lab for an apartment. That's, so, and then we just say, oh, congratulations, you've won Spot in the negotiations. And it freaks them out because they planned for, they hoped for this battleground, and you just let them win it. Okay. And that's one way to use the term narcissistic supply, is just pop that balloon. And once you think through the problem three-dimensionally, A lot of times clients, oh, yeah, I love Spot, but I can get another dog. And if I can stick it to her and have her, well, the other thing is they're afraid that that spouse is going to abuse Spot. And that's scary, but that's a whole different set of problems. And so working through the three-dimensional Rubik's Cube that is trying to play mind games during the divorce, that's why it's so important to have insight into that person's particular psyche, needs, narcissistic supply, and overall level of strategic thinking. Because a true smart narcissist would never put that much control, even if it's engineered to be toxic to the abused person. A deeply smart, strategic narcissist would never put that much power in their hands, if that makes sense. Because everything is three-dimensional in this world. And not everything has meaning, but yet it might. And so you have to be just super careful and thoughtful and patient in the communications, because the options are almost always more than what a client would possibly imagine.
Yeah, that makes sense. Talk about the other, steps or things to consider when divorcing, a narcissist, using the term vaguely. What are other things to consider?
Okay, so one of my biggest tips is to be smart on where you put your emotional energy. And one of the biggest wastes of emotional energy is trying to figure out, is this difficult aspect of my divorce the fault of my spouse or my spouse's lawyer? Who's driving this bus? Well, and I never really thought about this until I started talking and speaking with other lawyers about divorcing narcissists. But narcissists tend to find and hire and engage narcissistic and abusive lawyers. Now, all of that is somewhat predictable, and the tactics being used by a narcissistic lawyer are predictable, but it really doesn't matter who's driving the bus, because the bus is still moving down the road, and we're never going to know. Okay, because I'll take a client through a decision-making process early on, and I'll say, we should turn left because of A, B, and C, but we need to consider D, E, and F. And they'll go back and forth during the conversation 3-4 times. And so as the lawyer, I do have some influence over the decision-making process. And some lawyers will go out of their way to try to control the client and try to get them to turn left or right for any number of reasons, which may or may not be good reasons. So we'll never know how a particular decision was made. And many times decisions are made, the other side might make the right decision, but for the wrong reason, or the wrong decision for a good reason strategically. And so there's a lot of different ways we can look at it, but we're never going to understand. And so in my humble opinion on that, I tell them, let's not worry about that. I mean, we could sit here for an hour talking about it, but it's not going to change their decision. Now, what also makes it interesting is that just because a narcissist turns left early in the process doesn't mean they won't ever turn right. Because one of the things they're going to try to do is what I call, pressing buttons. They're going to try different buttons at different times to see what reaction they get from the spouse, because they've known which button to push 15, 20 years, because they've got that much data, and including the dating process. So it may be a really long time where one person has known where to push those buttons. And after separation, it's a matter of trial and error. And I'll tell them and predict this well in advance. There's going to be different. We know he or she's going to use the kids. They're going to be victims in this, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. We could maybe try to get them into counseling. There are certain things boundaries that the other spouse can't cross. So we know the kids are going to be used as weapons. But there's going to be other subtle things like spot. Going, what? Spot? No. Yes. All right. And the more unlikely, unseemly, toxic, the more likely that's going to be used. So we plan for what's going to come up. We discuss the fact that they're going to use certain tactics that are predictable. And so we're not going to be able to identify them all, but let me give you a couple of examples. And when it happens, you'll know, you'll run into it, especially when we get to settlement negotiations. We know what's in the estate. We know what we're asking the other spouse to agree to. And we engineer our approach to match and anticipate their moves on the chessboard, right? And there are a number of examples. So your original question was, what does the narcissist do in the divorce, and what do we do? Well, we try to plan for it in advance as best we can and inoculate our own client as best we can. And the best weapon we have, the best shield, is the emotional support team. Get your friend or family member to come in. Let's talk about what's been done, what our response needs to be, and to figure out a strategic move on the chessboard that is going to let the narcissist know that the control mechanism isn't going to work and that there's a new sheriff in town. I like to be the sheriff because I'm also a control freak, and I have a unique.
Which makes a good attorney.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so.
You made a comment just now that kind of led me from a question I had a few minutes ago about, when y'all decide on a plan, stick with it. But I know clients probably, will ask you questions repeatedly. And that's just more money. And these are going to be long cases often. Not that you're not worth the money, but how can people best communicate with you to make it more efficient and where they're using, your time wisely? And does that make sense?
Yes, but here's the thing. I may be unique in this. I want my client to tell me everything they think is important. Okay? Because it almost always is. It may not be that important right that minute, but it almost always comes back to being important. And if it's important to them, it needs to be important to me. So I'll get stories that don't impact the settlement all day long, but it gives me tremendous insight into the opposing party. And with that insight, it helps me craft a negotiation strategy. Okay, let's say we've got let me give you a concrete example. Let's say my client is describing Lucy, and the other spouse is like Lucy with a football, and when Charlie Brown comes to kick it, she moves it. Or always, you've heard in family therapy that one spouse is always moving the goalpost. Here's the goal, and I meet the goal, and then the goal moves. All right. So if you've got a person like that, it may be beneficial to play some of the exact same games. We call that mirroring their tactics. And just let them know that we're not going to get frustrated. We're not going to get impatient. We're not going to be emotionally destabilized, which is the goal of most negative negotiating tactics. So we want to react to anything done with as few words as possible. So where I'm going with that is when representing a spouse divorcing a true narcissist, we need to spend that time together. No detail is too small, because when we craft, as lawyers, when we craft our recommendation, many times it's about the emotional aspects of the divorce, much more important than the financial. because it is, especially with narcissists, much more of an emotional transaction than it is a financial. And so to some extent, we're in a game, so we might as well play it well. And the best way an experienced family lawyer can help a client is to know those boring details, to listen, hear the stories. Now, in terms of methods of communicating, one of my favorite tools is because I'm a visual learner, and most male lawyers are visual learners. And that's how they teach you in law school. You read, you go to class, you talk about what you read, and then you handwrite notes. And so all your thoughts are translated into words. Same thing in the courtroom. To be an effective trial lawyer, you have to be able to think, write, and speak about 3 different topics at one time. But 2 of those are visual. So my point is, I love to have my clients write detailed narratives telling me what happened, how they thought about it, and how they thought their spouse thought about it, and what any other witnesses thought about it. And then I can, over a cigar, read that at my leisure. And what I'm going to do, and I don't care if it's 35 pages, single spaced words, I'm going to read every word of it. And I'm going to highlight what's important for me to follow up with the client about. Because how they felt about a particular problem could be just as important as the problem itself, which is key to therapy and counseling. And 10 of the points that I come up with, oh, you need to tell your therapist about this, okay? Because this was awful. And that's what I think gets lost the most in all the discussions about narcissistic abuse and financial abuse. A lot of times it is horrific. You know, it could be something as simple as, well, I need to go to Birmingham for my aunt's funeral. Well, no, it's not in the budget. What do you mean it's not in the budget? Well, it's not in the budget for gas, so you can't go. No. I mean, what if that's your mother's closest sibling ever? You got to be there. So that when we talk about financial abuse, when we talk about the emotional abuse, it usually turns into some really bad stuff, because that will just kill you and having to deal with that. So, and usually it's been successful by the time they, at some level, and so usually a deep level by the time they get to me.
Yeah, we'll do that in therapy. And we'll also ask, how did you feel in your body when it was experienced? That body sensation can almost be more impactful than the feelings, because trauma is stored in the body.
Yeah. And I have no training on that. I know what stress feels like. I have stress a lot, especially when judges disagree with my legal analysis. And why would they disagree with me? You know, that's ridiculous. But yeah. And so I can't even begin to help them recover from that, but I can help them in terms of the emotional aspects of the negotiating process, which, like I said, often is more important to understand than the financial. And you may like this. So one of the tactics and tools I like to use is, if my client is in counseling and therapy, I want to call the therapist. I'm going to get a release from the, on the therapist form, releasing the communications to me. And I got 2 simple questions. How's my client doing? And what do you want me to know? And 90% of the time I make that call, I learn something terribly important and terribly helpful. And it's ridiculous. It's so simple. And that's one of the things that I always share with other lawyers who care what my opinion is. It's just a great tactic and tool to have. Almost every time I learn something that is ridiculously helpful, and that phone call could be 10 minutes, could be 5 minutes, could be half an hour. I've never had a mental health professional waste my time, promise you.
I think you've offered some tremendous advice, and I think, everyone could benefit from your videos and blog articles. It's going to be in the show notes. Could you tell everyone where they can find you?
Great. Thank you for asking. My name is Miles Mason Sr. I'm a lawyer and CPA in Memphis, but I only practice divorce law. I've enjoyed writing 4 books, 3 of which are available on Amazon.com. One is the Forensic Accounting Desk book published by the American Bar Association, Family Law Section, teaching family lawyers and forensic accountants how to look for hidden money. And also, I have MemphisDivorce.com, which contains much of my thought over the last 25 years practicing family law. I have hundreds of pages that include thousands of answers to frequently asked questions, videos, and other resources for both family lawyers and the public. That's all free. We've got a child support app that you can use to calculate your child support for free. It goes on your smartphone, available on the iPhone app platform as well as the Google app platform. So a lot of different things there. We got a blog where we do updates with legal commentary and analysis. And basically, I write and contribute to it about 30 minutes a day, nothing terribly special, but I try to have my thoughts put down, and other lawyers seem to enjoy reading that. And the clients and people, Google gives me the stats. I got people all over the world reading it. And part of that's military, people that are married, home bases in Tennessee, and they're stationed all over the world. So we have a lot of those folks reviewing it. And thank you for having me on. And I hope to include some of this material on my site as well.
Thank you. And we were talking before this, I stumbled upon one of his blogs, and it was either 2015 or around that time when I was just searching for answers, and they are great blogs. And as again, the course Hope After Narcissistic Abuse launches in February, so stay tuned for that. And we look forward to having you listen on the next episode. Thank you again. Thank you again for tuning in to our podcast, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. We hope you were able to leave with some renewed hope. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe to the channel, give us a review, head to the show notes for more information on the things that we highlighted. And there's also a link to the website for a course that we offer on the same topic, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. Thank you again, and please tune in to the next episode.